Good morning, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in today, early or not with us. Whether you are joining us live or watching the replay of this session on reinventing restaurants and rethinking wine lists. I am Pauline Ricard, the co-founder and executive director of ARENI Global, which is a research and action institute dedicated to the future of fine wine, and it's my huge pleasure to be your host today and guide the discussion for the next hour and a half. So Insight series are part of our annual research and action program, and they aim to provide a platform to international thought leaders, just like the great panel we have today and the audience that we have today as well, to share ideas and address global issues collectively. I am thrilled to host so many of you today. It's a pleasure, as always, to welcome our core members in the audience, but also so many new names that I can only wish were matched with a face. I can't wait to see you all in real life. Just so you know, ARENI is a non-profit organization, so there are several ways that you can help us. Tanisha in the chat is going to drop some links, and you are of course more than welcome to explore further what we do in terms of research, in terms of events, or in terms of publication program. And indeed, if you are in a position to do so, please consider being a member, either as an individual or as a business. And of course, final thing, if you are not following us on social, please do. It always helps. And also subscribe to our newsletter if you want to receive the recordings of the video and all, everything that's coming ahead. Rules of conversation, as there are quite a lot of us today. We want this session to be yours as much as possible. So of course we prep some questions with my co-panelist James, but if you, and thanks also to all of you that send questions prior to the webinar, we've tried as much as possible to integrate them. Please use the chat to comment and add your thoughts to the mix, because I know that we've got loads of sommeliers from everywhere around the world. I didn't count the countries, but I'm sure we've got at least 20 different countries and origin. So tell us what's happening in your country, react to what the panelist says, because I'm going to read that and use it for our post-analysis article that's going to be published next week. So it's always super interesting to read about your point of view and your experience. And if you have questions for those panelists in particular, please use the Q&A, because otherwise I might, James and I might not see them going on the chat. Before we start, maybe some context on that conversation. This is part of a wider exploration, because as everything that we do at ARENI, we try to take the bird eye view on a particular topic. And for this one, try to globally think about what will impact the future of restaurants and consequently what will impact their wine list. So we already have a lot of resources available on our website, and I invite you to visit or revisit our latest podcast, some including, food writer Alicia Kennedy and food anthropologist Véronique Bardot, and to stay tuned throughout all the months of March, because we are going to continue this conversation and have, even more angle added to the mix of thoughts. Please note also, because I had some questions about this prior to the webinar, that we are going to focus on fine wine. I know how difficult it is to define what fine wine is, and that could be a webinar on its own. Again, Tanisha is going to share the white paper that we wrote at ARENI, but I think for this conversation, we can all agree that, we are going to discuss quality, higher price points, not bottom shelf of supermarket, mass market wines. Nothing wrong with those wines, of course, but it's not going to be the ones that we are going to talk about. And of course, when we are going to discuss restaurants, it's indeed the restaurants that do carry those type of wines in the wine list. We are also deeply aware that the context of in which restaurants are going to reopen or fully reopen, for those of you that are not totally closed, will be highly depending on where the restaurant is based and the government support that has been available throughout the last year. And there are not, that much pressure that we can put on government, though there are some actions that we can do. But for this discussion, we will try to see if, apart from this, there are like global trends, global levers of change that we can identify. I am now going to introduce the panel that's with us today, but while I'm doing this, when we prep that conversation, we came up with some element of answers to one of the key questions that we are going to explore today, which is what are the main cultural, social and economical change that restaurateurs and beverage director will need to take into account. So I've built a little poll for you. Let's see if that's worked, because today is a bit of a funny tech day. So here's the poll. I hope you can see that in your screen. And while you are answering this, and I invite you all to have a look and answer, it's a multiple choice question. That is my great pleasure to introduce the fine minds that are going to explore that great topic with us today. So first, my co-panelist of the day, James Tidwell, Master Sommelier. James, I am so happy that you accepted to moderate with me and that you started the webinar. You kicked us starting today. It's the first time for both of us to co-moderate together. So let's see how it goes. But many of you in the audience know James as the founder of TechSom Conference, now in its 15th year, and along with the TechSom International Wine Awards. And in 2020, James, you joined the highly regarded team of the World's Best Wine List Awards, organized by the World of Fine Wine magazine, which is an amazing magazine that goes really deep into exploring the future of fine wine. So I can't recommend that magazine highly enough if you don't know it already. So James, who are our first panelists today?
Well, first, thanks for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure. Our first panelist today is Tinashe Nyamadoka, and I believe I got that correct, Tinashe. He's a sommelier and founder of Kumusha Wines in South Africa. He's a fixture on the South African fine dining scene, most often associated with the Test Kitchen in Cape Town, which is cited as one of the top restaurants in South Africa and where I first met him. In the past decade, in my opinion, he's become one of the definitive voices in the South African wine scene. He serves as an independent wine judge from local competitions all the way to Mundusvini in Germany. And he's a partner at Som on Call, which is an online wine buying platform based in South Africa. So quite a well-rounded experience. Our next panelist is Ray Isle. Most people in the US, I think, in the food and beverage industry know Ray, but you know, he is one of the icons in the business, executive wine editor of Food and Wine magazine. He's been nominated twice for a James Beard Award, has twice won the IACP Award for narrative beverage writing, and his work appears in the Best Food Writing 2017. Well deserved at that. His extensive experience with restaurants and his network of restaurateurs, chefs, and sommeliers gives him unique insight into the dining landscape in the US and beyond, in my opinion, and he offers quite a good overview of the US industry. John Pepper is Master of Wine. He's run companies in every sector of the wine trade. I think you'll see a theme throughout our panelists today in that John has been in wineries, distributors, and retailers, so another person with well-rounded experience. He's currently managing director of Tenuta del Mundo. It is an ultra-premium wine group and owns several wineries you would recognize. In addition to that, he previously was chief operating officer of Anotria & Co., who anyone in the UK will know, but for those of us around the world, it's one of the UK's leading wine and spirit suppliers to the on-trade and was just voted as, I believe, top supplier to the on-trade. So those are our first three panelists. And back to you, Pauline.
Well, and to complete this amazing panel, we have the pleasure to welcome Antoine Abou Samra, based in Lebanon and creator of A Table for Two, which is a multi-format content creation house. And Antoine used the thread of food and wine to not only help the audience discover and understand other cultures, but also to engage them in related issues such as the environment, climate change, sustainability, and diversity. And of course, those will be key themes that we are going to discuss today. Antoine, thank you so much for being with us. Stéphane, and I'm sorry, Lochner, I'm really sorry for that, butchering your family name with my French accent, but Stéphane started his career as a chef and rapidly joined the other side, so selling kitchen equipment to restaurants, but now rethinking their organization with the new context of delivery and takeaways in mind. So we had a lot of questions about, ghost kitchen, dark kitchen, cloud kitchen, and their impact, of course, on beverage lists. And Stéphane, I can't wait to explore more of that particular part with you. Thanks for being with us. And finally, and I'm going to go all French, traditional pride, but we couldn't have a panel on the future of food and gastronomy without, France and a French panelist, of course. Laurent Plantier co-created Ducasse Entreprise with Alain Ducasse himself, who's one of the most famous French chefs in the world, I guess, and developed the group both in France and internationally. Laurent, you led the group diversification, to hospitality, education, of course, because I know education is so important to you. And now Laurent is a partner in French Food Capital. We're going to talk about this a bit more in a second, but that's an investment fund backing leading companies in the food and non-alcoholic beverage. If you want to know why Laurent has not yet invested in wine, you can ask that in the chat if you want, because that's an interesting answer. Well, thank you so much for voting, and I'm going to end the poll now, and I will share the results with you a bit later in the webinar, because it's about time that we start. And Laurent, I'd like to actually start with you, because one of the first things that restaurateurs will have to take into account when reopening or fully reopening is the fact that there would be less money, probably a bit everywhere in the restaurant supply chain and in the pocket of the consumer. So how is the current crisis likely to impact restaurants' business models? How do we need to change it to make sure that we'll still make ends meet? That's a big question that I'm throwing you to start the conversation. But what about the business model of restaurants and gastronomic restaurants that you know so well?
Thank you, Pauline. And forgive my horrible French accent. I hope everyone understands why I'm talking. As you said, and I believe nobody is surprised that the financial situation of the restaurant, at least in our country, but I believe everywhere in the world, has been dramatically impacted by the situation. And okay, restaurants and restaurateurs will have more debt if they still have some cash when they will reopen the restaurant. So it will mean that you are more worried about the way you will manage your business, and it will have an impact. I do believe in the way you will adapt your menu, the way you will certainly adapt your charges, the way you will address staff issues, which in my belief is that you will have shorter menu, shorter wine list, less inventory. They will have to answer the question of who will bear the cost of the inventory of wine. How you will address a restaurant with less staff, still bringing the level of services and the quality asked by a consumer. But I also do believe that the consumer itself has changed their habit, and that your restaurateur will need to address these changes. They need to adapt to the consumer. And
so if I sum up a bit,
sure.
you're saying that restaurants like Alain Ducasse, so that type of high level gastronomic restaurants, the way they can adapt and the way they can still make money, because that's such a big important part of the restaurant, is by maybe having shorter menus, shorter wine lists. I know that together when we prepare that webinar, we talked a lot about who is going to stock the wines now. Like, is it going to be the restaurants as traditionally, they were building cellars for years? I would love to know your opinion on the audience also, like sommeliers in your restaurants. Are you still buying? Are you still building a cellar? Or do you think you're going to transfer that cost of aging to suppliers or to the winery itself? Using your hats at French food capital, Laurent, as an investor now, when you invest in company today in 2021, have you changed the way you look at business models, and have you changed the way you assess, your interest in investing compared to how you assessed companies before the crisis?
Well, I'm a firm believer that a company and a restaurant need to respond to the consumer, which means that when you invest, you want a company that captures the spirit of the time, the zeitgeist, as they say in Germany, And what has changed, I'm sure it is the spirit of the time today after COVID than before. So you always want to answer the question, do the company I invest in have the right service, the right product that totally captures the spirit of the time? And for sure, and we'll talk that later, that today the consumer spend more in click and collect, in delivery, maybe in more conscious, they are more conscious about health, sustainability issue. So we do want to invest in the company, whether it is a restaurant or not a restaurant, that really understand the way the consumer is going. But about today and the restaurant world, I do believe that there may be two different routes that are totally opposed. One is everybody's thinking about that we want to address a more conscious consumer, ethical eating, plant-based, less sugar, less waste, sustainable eating, whatever, farm to table, and all these trends that we understand. But I do believe that we may see another route that everyone will be willing to live, spend, go out, spend the money they have saved during a year, and like La Belle Époque, drinking champagne, which means that it may create like a bubble, and if we have a financial bubble, an increase in the value of the Bitcoin, an increase in value of contemporary art, we will have also something crazy that will go in restaurant, in creativity, and people will look like in a bit when Ferran Adria started, which means much more creativity and experience and thinking for experience. So we may have two different routes in the way people would like to spend their money in restaurant, and I don't know where we will be for sure.
And thanks, Laurent. And John, before moving to your winemaker hat, let's use your expertise also in distributing wine. Less money, maybe less business, or as Laurent described, different ways in which restaurants will adapt their concept, their menu, and their wine list. That means also a big shift for fine wine suppliers. How can specialists, distribution specialists like Enotria, but of course like others, how can they adapt their offers, their team, their systems to both survive and best accompany that change in the restaurant world?
I think it's interesting, and just picking up on the second part of what Laurent said there, I think when the world came out of the First World War It sparked the Roaring '20s, and there was this huge explosion and celebration around the world. And that was at a time when consumers were probably more restrained in their behavior, and there was less conspicuous consumption than we have in the 21st century. And I think there's a strong chance that when you combine 20th century hedonism and the conspicuous consumerism of the 21st century with this release from lockdown that we've all been enjoying for the last year, I think there's a chance that there'll be an enormous party as countries come out of lockdown. And I think the real challenge for restaurants, for the on-trade, and for suppliers like big on-trade suppliers is going to be how to cope with the unpredictability of that release. And I think amongst all of that, what's going to be really key is flexibility. So I think in terms of distributors' offers, I think there'll be a definite focus on value. And I say value rather than cost, because I think consumers will want to spend money, but they'll be cautious about what they're spending money on after a period of not going out. And obviously, restaurant wine lists compared to off-trade wine lists present a very different value offer. So I think as a distributor, it's really about helping restaurants to anticipate those consumer desires and perhaps taking advantage of international connections to see markets that are coming out of lockdown early and take the learnings that we can from those markets and translate them into local markets. But really, it's going to be about cooperation and working with restaurants to give the right support and the right product.
And how does that translate in a practical level? Does it mean picking up your phone and calling people, go and see them, like have a newsletter? Like what can we do on a practical level?
I think communication is going to be absolutely key. I think it's going to be speed of response from distributors, so the ability to anticipate changing consumer needs, but respond rapidly as behavior in restaurants changes. So it's going to be all about making sure that lines of communication are short, that stock levels at distributors are good, and that they're prepared to react quickly in terms of quick order fulfillment, smaller deliveries. There's clearly going to need to be some flexibility in terms of credit lines that are extended, because as sales grow, so required credit lines will grow. But obviously, everybody at every stage in the distribution channel is going to be short on cash to start. But also, I think for distributors to try to add value by recognizing that restaurants are going to be short-staffed as people come off furlough, and to be able to provide sort of ready-made solutions for restaurants in terms of wine list suggestions, products, great value products, experiential suggestions and activation suggestions, so that restaurants can bring those products to life for consumers who are looking to celebrate.
Before giving the floor to James, because I know he's got some questions too, but what's your opinion on what Laurent said earlier about who's going to carry the cost of aging? Because when we talk about fine wine, that's a big part. So with both your hats of distributor, well, former distributor and winery now, who do you think is in the best position to take care of that cost of aging?
I think ultimately it requires collaboration, because the cash will enter the chain through the restaurants and flow back through the distributors to the wineries. But the wineries and the distributors are going to have to make the investment to pump stock through the chain into the restaurants in order for that to happen in the first place. And I think that probably requires flexibility on all parts in terms of credit limits and payment terms, because as sales increase rapidly, the required credit limits will increase with them. But the distributors will require some of that cash to flow back down the chain. So I think we're going to need to see, again, really good communication and flex on both credit limits down chain and payments back up chain, so that everybody's getting a share of supply and the cash coming back. I think where people are willing to work together and be flexible in both directions, then everybody can benefit from the resulting sales growth. But I think people who are rigid in the application of a more traditional way of applying that cash flow management will really struggle.
Thanks, John. James, from sommelier to sommelier, you had a question for Tinashe. You're on mute, James, sorry. There you can speak, I think.
So particularly for Tinashe, with restaurants possibly looking at less cash, less money, that would, of course, most likely translate to fewer positions on the floor and sommelier positions. So in the big picture, how do you feel that an absence of a dedicated sommelier on the floor of a restaurant affects wine consumption? How could it be detrimental to that, or could it be?
Yeah, definitely. I think we can all agree that the sommelier interaction on the floor was helping to increase the guest checks in restaurants and making it easy to punch those fine wines and much more expensive wines to sustain the restaurant, and take that out of the equation, take that influence of food and wine recommendation, which gives another added experience that can make guests spend more. So you're having a void, which is difficult to fill in a bigger picture. But then again, I'll have to say it is going to be a whole concerted effort for everyone in the whole wine value chain to make sure that there is enough resources, be it training or incentives, so that the remaining staff in the restaurants can at least be, knowledgeable or well experienced to sell the wine. And obviously, maybe most restaurants, and I know especially in South Africa, can't afford permanent sommelier position. You might need to outsource or on a consulting basis.
And sorry, James, go on.
All right, go ahead.
No, I just, when we talk about staff, and as we discussed with James, there would probably be a follow-up webinar on that particular questions of, new skills for sommelier and how to build them up, because we've got questions for today, but if ever we don't have time, we'll do a follow-up webinar. But the funny point that we discussed with Laurent is that question of staff is going to be two ways. So of course, people on the floor will have to take new skills, but maybe restaurateurs will also have to change their argument and also be more attractive to staff. Like when you're really looking for experienced waiters or experienced sommelier, because after a year of staying at home and having their family and enjoying their Sundays, maybe the condition. Laurent, can you touch base on that? Like, how do you think that's going to impact people coming back on the floor?
I do believe that in the restaurant world, most of the people have been working every night, every evening in the restaurant without having a family life, and they're used to it. But do you imagine all these people having a family life for 1 year, and maybe some of them are enjoying it and don't want to go back to former life. So maybe the risk also, like in city like in New York, where a lot of French people went back to France and maybe don't have the money to pay their rent and come back to New York. So there will be a lack of staff for sure, because some people will have taken some other jobs, and we will have to compete. A restaurant will have to compete with the best one. So as also young generation is expecting different things they get out of their jobs, then I do believe restaurant and chef will have to adapt to the need of this new generation, and to create the places, a workplace where they will attract these people, because the competition will be fierce at the beginning to have the right people and who want to work again in the restaurant come back. And that's a belief. I don't know if it's true, but I don't believe that all the restaurants will just raise their hand and all the staff will come back motivated and knowledgeable, wanted to work in like in 1 minute.
Ray, is that a French perspective, or do you feel it's going to be the same in the US? Who will own the power? Is it the restaurants because so many people have been out of a job, or is it also the experienced staff because they will have, maybe more routes to follow?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I doubt it will be black and white in that way. In that, I've talked to a number of sommeliers who are, or wine directors who are high up enough that they're still employed by their restaurants. And one of the big concerns is how do they rebuild these teams that they built over several years. you know, there's a story about a Somm in Philadelphia who's now managing a bicycle store, you know, because he's out of work. Does he go back to being a sommelier after working as a bicycle store manager? It's hard to know. And as to who has the power, I mean, the person doing the hiring usually has more power than the person being hired. It's kind of the nature of our economic structure. I do think one of the things you said earlier I thought was interesting in the context of fine wine. You made a comment about the lack of economic resource and so on. But it's I think in the U.S. at least, it's important to remember that in the context of fine wine, the rich have largely gotten richer during this event. The stock market has been up. The sort of people who buy things like Ligier Bellay, you know, DRC, whatever, are actually sitting on more money than they used to be sitting on. The people who've gotten hurt by this are disproportionately the poorer, which means line cooks, dishwashers, etc. So there is a structural problem there as well in terms of who has the power and who has the money, which weirdly disproportionately doesn't affect the super high fine wine side of things. It's going to affect, I think, the smaller restaurant that had, you know, I was talking to a friend who owns a small but ambitious restaurant in Brooklyn, and he said, I'm not going to go into this again with the kind of cellar depth I had before because I'm locking up too much money in case something happens. I'd rather have more going into it now. I'd rather have more free cash. That's different than being a 3-star Michelin situation. But he's the kind of guy who buys, you know, affordable $40 Southern Italian wines and also has, you know, Tête de Cuvée champagne on the list. And that's, I think, where the problem gets really complicated and interesting and difficult. So just a couple of thoughts on that situation.
And I think it also going to depend, you know, the less money. I had a conversation with Paul Gurieco also to prep for that thing, and he said, well, it all depends also on how much corporate money you use to depend on, and what kind of corporate you use to work with, because for sure individual people will, you know, need to celebrate and go out if they're not too scared of going out and be in restaurants again, but maybe corporate spending is not going to be what it was before, and we highly depend on corporate spending as well in wine bars. So I guess depending on what,
it's also very situational and locational in that regard. Yeah. That, like, so for instance, Food and Wine's offices where I am now are down in the financial district in Manhattan. There's no one here. The buildings are empty, and there's a lot of sense that large financial companies aren't going to bring their people back to their offices until November at the earliest, and that has a direct effect on restaurants in this neighborhood that wouldn't be the same as a neighborhood restaurant, even an ambitious one in Brooklyn, for instance, that relies on a local population that lives there as opposed to comes in for work.
And London has lost, I think, 8% of its population, which is huge. And, you know, going through more data on who did we lost, is that, you know, the kitchen porter or the billionaires? That's going to be also an interesting data. But one of the ways that restaurants actually coped, like you were saying, Ray, of being in districts where nobody lived anymore, is with deliveries and takeaways. And I think we've all seen that, like restaurants have been adapted to that. They've proposed delivering menus, sometimes wine delivery as well, when they had the license in their country. And one of the phenomena that continued to grow and really benefited from maybe the crisis is what we call dark kitchen, ghost kitchen. I know that's a bit of a gray area that us in the wine world don't really know about that much. Stefan, could you actually, Stefan is passionate about dark kitchen. So if you've got more questions that we don't have the time to address, go ahead, because he really likes his job, which is amazing. What's dark kitchen and how do they operate, so we can understand if that's actually something that will affect us or not?
Yes, Pauline, thank you very much. Actually, dark kitchen, cloud kitchen, virtual kitchen, there's many names. It's sometimes also related to the area of the world where some names are more prominent or less. At the end, it's all the same. It's a kitchen made for delivery purpose only. That's the main reason of a dark kitchen or cloud kitchen or ghost kitchen, as we call it. So, and we also should understand that the trend for delivery and therefore having dedicated specialized sites or kitchens to produce this food was already prior to COVID. So that's not new. But however, as many things we see at the moment, COVID definitely accelerated this trend. So currently we can expect that worldwide approximately 10% of the food eaten is eaten by delivery food worldwide at the moment. It seems to be more than we expect, but looking to China, India, many places in the United States, food delivery has become already mainstream. And therefore, the requirement to have ghost kitchens to produce this food efficiently is increasing. And what we can expect is actually in the next 20 years, so 10 to 20 years, about 2030, the predictions are that up to 30% of any dollar spent on food will come from delivery. So this will have a massive impact. So we will see definitely a reduction in brick and mortar restaurants, which also has a significant impact on your business, especially on the wine business. On the other hand, the food delivery, in fact, is driven mainly by basic needs. So people order food because they are hungry. And there comes the big difference between upscale food, Michelin star food, and fine wine. Because we will definitely have a split into two areas in the future. We will have convenience given by eventually delivery, and we will have experience. And this is where you come into the play. So people enjoying food in a fine restaurant, enjoying a 10-course or 12-course meal with nice wine accompanying it. This is all about experience. And here comes the question, if considering that nowadays ghost kitchens are for the purpose of delivering food mainly, we all know that the food, or let's say the beverages purchased together with these deliveries, if coming from the ghost kitchen, are rather basic, mostly non-alcoholic, in fact. Or people, of course, tend to procure their beverages from retail in parallel. But here comes the question, how can the upscale gastronomy, fine winemakers, how can you participate in the growing trend of food delivery? And we also had different considerations about that. So the main question would be, how can you get the experience back? And I like to comment on what Laurent said. He said it's nothing left than order, click, and collect. And this is where I think we need to rethink. The next opportunity which arises for you is how to create additional experience with the wine you sell, knowing that not everybody who orders wine and food will be maybe your potential customers for this particular segment. But this could be a great opportunity. Consider yourself in the same, let's say, boat with the Michelin star restaurants who also have problems delivering their perfect food quality to the end customer. Problem of the last mile, we call it. Yeah? It's very difficult to deliver an appoint rack of lamb to a customer in an eatable temperature. It's nearly impossible. So that's why the menus need to be specifically made to fit the delivery purpose. But considering that you would pair up with appropriate restaurants or appropriate restaurant brands to create a menu which is suitable in a high quality for delivery, together with accompanying wine, could be a very nice food and beverage mix. And this needs to be positioned separately of the mainstream delivery apps or brands. This must be a separate line, a high-class delivery platform. And I want to also go back to Tinash. You said experience. I would like to point out that again. This could be the moment of the sommeliers. I mean, imagine if you buy, I don't know, $200 or more bottle of wine online, which I have not done yet, but I would. In that case, I would expect some experience, like some sommelier giving me an online entertainment on this, like introducing the wine to me, telling me a story about the wine, where it comes from, maybe some interview with the winemaker. You know, for that price, I could have a 30 minutes online.
And that's actually, you know, Fine Minds comes to light, because that's one of the projects Nash has been working on. We'll touch on that later. But just to summarize a bit, because you've said so many interesting things. First, dark kitchens are not, you know, real restaurants. They are places where we finish the food. So when you, for example, order your Chinese delivery or you know, whatever things that you buy from your app and your computer, there's a likely chance that it comes not from a real restaurant, but from a dark kitchen, which is outside of town, that relies on data to know how to target consumers, and they will just, you know, finish the seasoning of your dish and send it, like they have a couple of minutes, right, to get it ready so it can go on delivery. And there's a huge data system behind that allow you to be super precise in the preparation, the targeting of the consumers and everything. So far, we've seen restaurants that do not really compete in the fine wine list, because even before COVID, nobody was buying a bottle of fine wine with a Chinese delivery kind of food. But what you are saying, Stefan, is because that model works so well in having targeted data, in knowing where the consumers are, in knowing how to deliver on time, maybe there's something that gastronomic restaurants could use there and could partner up with, maybe not for a full menu, but like for a nice box of cheese and charcuterie, something that doesn't really need to be cooked, but that could be branded under the Alain Ducasse, for example, food, charcuterie and cheese box with a bottle of fine wine. Laurent, how does that sound? Does that sound possible for the gastronomic world? And how do you see all those fine wine restaurants that have launched delivery offers? How do you see them evolve when they can reopen? Are they going to continue delivery? Are they going to stop delivery? You're still mute, Laurent. You're on mute. Laurent, we can't hear you, and I can't unmute.
Because I'm on mute. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I firmly believe that it's not because you do one thing very well doesn't mean that you will do, and you could do everything very well. So I'm not talking about delivery food for feeding yourself less than 20 euro, but we're talking about fine dining, to answer back your question, if I understood well. Well, first, I believe that you need to be able to do it, which means that if you have a restaurant today, your restaurant is closed, you don't have any consumer, so it's easy for you to use your staff, your kitchen space, to make delivery food. Whether you do it well or not, it's another it's another story. But tomorrow, what you do is creating an experience in your restaurant, cooking food for your live customer. I believe that most of the restaurants won't be able to do both. Now is also to answer a need. Today, maybe some people just, they're at home, they have nothing to do, okay, they order food, whatever. They want to create, to experience different type of food at home. They don't have any other alternative, so for sure they order food. But tomorrow, why do people will order food at home, gourmet food, instead of going to a restaurant? Well, what will be the need? I don't have the answer, but do we personalized cook just for me when you order, or will you be able to try that with the same experience in the restaurant? I don't know, and at the end, I do believe that it needs to fit the DNA of the chef or the DNA of the restaurant, and I think that most of the chefs doesn't fit that DNA to do delivery food, because I've done this business to greet the client and to create a great experience. So
yes, so
my
what,
answer is it doesn't fit everywhere. It doesn't fit everywhere.
And what you are saying, Laurent, is also there's a need to be agile, there's a need to be flexible, just like John and everyone else has underlined that. But there's also a need to not forget who you are, and not forget, what you stand for, and adapt your model according to that. Before moving to Antoine, because I really want to hear about you as well, Antoine. And James, I know you had a comment that you wanted to address.
Well, I think amongst the three last to comment, we're seeing a few things, and one of those from a sommelier perspective is the evolution of the sommelier. Ray brought out the idea of money on a shelf. One of my previous positions, I was told every bottle of wine represents capital sitting on a shelf. And the sommelier has to become, and is becoming, much more of a financial manager as well, in justifying why that's appropriate, when it may be and when it may not be. We also got the question in the chat about opportunities with ghost kitchens and with delivery, as to whether there would be opportunities to sell more obscure wines that were traditionally sold by sommeliers. I think in some cases they will still be sold by sommeliers, but through dark kitchens or through delivery, because the evolution of the sommelier is that sommeliers are now being hired into retail, as Ray noted, bike shops. maybe not as a sommelier, but it's interesting to see how that's evolving. And I think if we get too bound to our tradition, then we miss opportunities. And you know, the sommelier position has evolved over the years anyway. So I think we're seeing a lot of opportunity for the sommelier position to evolve and actually to become a richer position for restaurants in terms of what it can offer.
And Tinashe, I will come back to that, because after that, well, maybe we can discuss that now, because it's really linked. Because you've launched Some on Call. Do you want to tell us a bit more about this initiative, and because it's so related to what Stefan actually was saying too?
Yeah, it's quite almost in the same line as Stefan was saying, and what the other panelist was saying, that, you know, it's not like in the current situation everyone doesn't have money necessarily. They might not be coming in the restaurant, but they still have money to spend. So when we came up about the Some on Call experience, was okay, we might not have the guest in the restaurant, but the sommelier position is still relevant, and I can still be able to find those obscure wines, or I can still punch those expensive wines. But why not follow where the guest is right now? And we figured out the guest was on their phone. So we almost took the restaurant floor, not make it in a physical, but put it in a digital space. So I'm there talking to the guest, getting online interaction is quite real time. People ask me about wine. We put out offers. This is the wines we have, and we've actually put a wine list on the website. This is the wines we have on the wine list. If they sell out, we put new wines. So I think it's been working well. So we've kind of rolled it out in South Africa. It's been 5 months and it's running pretty well. The turnout is coming out a bit more. So I can agree with Stefan that I'll take it also as a dark or ghost wine seller, if you put it that way. And I think my main challenge would be, how can I link this dark cellar with Stefan's dark kitchen? Because in South Africa, for instance, I think the legislation is quite against me. If that dark kitchen was able to, or allowed to operate on a liquor license, then we can plug the same concept together and it will work out. And I think also to come to most of the high-end restaurants in South Africa, the ones on the top gastronomic level, if you ask them, the quality might not be the same if it's takeaway, but their main challenge is that the traditional delivery model makes their food much more expensive. So I think if they're operating on a dark kitchen where they don't have the most overhead costs, their food becomes affordable for people at home to order. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, that's also a very important point that you raised, is like in food and beverage in F&B, and usually in traditional restaurant, the money comes from the B, so and the beverage. So restaurants, that's a conundrum that every restaurant will have to balance and will have to juggle, is how to keep doing money with a beverage list with less staff, and surely having you know, external service like yours could be a potential, surely surely an interesting thing to look into it. I'd like to go to Antoine now, because you've been listening to us so far.
Fascinating conversation. I loved it. Just before, if I can just say one thing. Coming back also to what Laurent was saying, okay, I'm from a generation that grew up pre-internet, and restaurant is a place, it's a social place, it's a convivial place. So I can understand that it's very convenient, you know, to have your food delivered at home, but the whole purpose of a restaurant, the whole purpose of going out is to socialize, is to see other people. And if everything is going to end up just being, you know, with screens and people on a call and getting your food at your door and not going out from home and not seeing the world and not seeing people, that would be sad. So just a quick comment on that.
And actually, it's a perfect tie-in, because I mean, to me, and that's just my personal takeaway, but I think restaurants will need to be even more a place of connection, because that's really the thing that I miss. That's totally biased on my perspective, but I want to be able to connect even more, to connect to the food, to connect to the wine, but to connect to everything, like the global ecosystem when I go to a restaurant. And that's actually interesting to ask you and Ray that question about the role of food and wine media in accompanying those transition. And we received popular food writer Alicia Kennedy in our latest podcast, as I've said earlier, and she states, I believe it's the role of the food writer, or food media, as you want, to force readers to continually recognize the reality of the food system and those who labor in it. And if you take that comment in a global perspective, if, you know, we've heard different crises about staff in restaurants and how they were treated. We've heard, of course, we're all aware of the scandal in food and the scandal in wine. Not to draw, you know, sorry, my very unclear question was, does talking about what is bad more important than what dreamy to help our industry in the long run? And how can we address, how can we use that situation to address what was bad, to communicate about it, and to make it better? Does that make sense, Antoine? My question.
Yes, it does.
If you want to take it first, and then Ray, of course, I'd like you to comment on that.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think it's very important. There's a lot of things that we talk about, you know, in food and wine world, you know, about the nice part, about the dreamy part, about the good taste, and, you know, all those great dishes. But talking about, I wouldn't say it's a bad side. I don't think it's good versus evil. I think it's more about awareness. I think people have to understand that what they're eating, the way they're eating, has an impact. And if they are more aware of it, then they can take decisions. They can have a choice. And I think that's very important. Very often, you know, you've seen many books, Fast Food Nations, Omnivore's Dilemma, a lot of documentaries talking about this. But has it changed people's behavior? Potentially at the fringe, yes. But I think this is why it's people are probably now much more aware of the importance, because locked up at home, COVID, they had to cook. So the relationship with ingredients and food and cooking is much more important than it used to be. That's my take on that. And people are much more aware of the importance of the produce. Now, if they start to understand that their choices, their selection has an impact on, you know, on climate, on the environment, on how people are treated, because if it's an industrialized production line for their food, then probably the people that are going to be employed there are not cherished and cared so much about. It could have impact on their health as well. So it's not about proselytizing and telling them, no, this is not what you should eat. It's about telling them, you have a choice. These are alternatives. And if you try to go towards these alternatives, this is how you can change lives of people in lesser developed countries, in people that are in more need. People are actually trying to grow food in a more, I'm not going to say natural, because in a more sustainable way. And that awareness needs to be definitely reinforced. That's what I think.
Ray, do you think this topic could be a way for restaurants to connect, or to, I don't know, to create value more when they reopen, to share those stories? And how do you do it at Food and Wine? How has your style of writing and the topic that you covered have evolved and will continue to evolve?
Well, I think, let's see, you know, that I think that it's important, particularly as a food writer or a wine writer, to know what's going on with how restaurants work, who's, you know, what the inequalities are, how it affects the environment, and in all the ways that food and or wine connect to the entire fabric of the social and physical world. I mean, it's not just, you know, this bottle of Burgundy is wonderful and it tastes like cherries, because that's fine, but it doesn't necessarily get at the heart of everything. That said, realistically, sometimes readers come to a magazine like Food and Wine and they want a recipe for a hamburger with Swiss cheese on it, and they don't necessarily want you know, a diatribe about the inequality, the horrible way that cows are treated in factory, even though cows are emphatically horribly treated in mass market meat production. At the same time, people often do want that, and so as a publication, you've got a balancing act where you try and be socially conscious and effective in getting across this information. And at the same time, you get some stuff that's pure service. I mean, I end up doing a column sometimes that's wines for grilling, and then I do a column that's about how wine bars have been affected by inequalities in how restaurants hire or something like that. And so it's not a again, it's not a binary thing, but I do think that there's more and more consciousness about these issues, even for the readers who thought that they only wanted, how to put Swiss cheese on a burger and melt it effectively. It's much more present in the reader's interest these days, which I think is great. And I think, it's a shift. You've seen it with wine, with consumer interest in organics and consumer interest in climate effects of wine. And I think that probably the kind of questions of social justice or social inequality in wine will follow in the same pattern. And there are certainly wine buyers who are more and more wine buyers who are going to want to know how this wine was made and who was it made by and how were those people treated. And I think that will be present in restaurants as well, whether that's a part of service. I don't honestly know, and it probably depends on your restaurant audience. If your restaurant audience is in Williamsburg, it's different than if it's a bunch of business guys in Midtown. And the responsibility of the restaurant to talk about how the laborers were treated in the vineyard in Puglia. Since I'm not a restaurant guy, I don't know actually how you translate that to customer service, but it's an interesting question for the sommeliers in this group. How much. My brief experience being a sommelier, and I wouldn't even call myself a sommelier, serving wine to people in restaurants because my technical skills are bad, is that the interaction is actually very short. It's surprising how little time you have with customers. And so that question of how you impart those issues or awareness of those issues to a customer in a restaurant, and do they want to know it, is a really interesting one. But I think as a journalist and as a magazine, it's incumbent on us to consider them and to talk about them.
And to your point, Ray, it's the same on sustainability. We've got that question all the time. Like, do fine wine needs to be sustainable? Because when someone buys a first cru Bordeaux, they actually don't really care how it's made. But actually, as you were saying, the trade care and sommelier do care more and more. And they even if they don't communicate it to the consumer, they will take that into consideration when they buy and when they make their wine list. Perfect tie-in, James, because you wanted to go on my list.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and Ray, following up what you just said, I think much of what you said there at the end speaks to is the guest there for the sommelier, or is the sommelier there for the guest? And there's this idea that the chef, as an ego-driven chef, is irrelevant now. It's over, and it probably needs to be as a concept. But to you, and then passing that also to Laurent and Tinashe, if you'd like to chip in, could the same be said for the Somm? Is the ego-driven Somm era over, if it ever existed? And some of us would argue it probably did. Is that over? And what's next after that? I mean, what comes next for sommeliers in that context?
Yeah,
Ray?
I think just said.
Would you like to? Oh, cool. Tinashe. Perfect.
Yeah, to a certain degree, I think the ego kind of fizzled out on the restaurant scene. But I still think the sommelier voice is still quite evident, and it has switched over. I know quite a lot of sommeliers I follow in the States have gone mainstream online, social, startup wine clubs, wine bars. And I think the voice is still going to be there. But I think the egoism on the restaurant and who's got the perfect beverage list, I think that's a thing of the past.
And Ray, since you had brought up that idea, what is your thought in terms of sommeliers and that idea of the ego-driven chef and the ego-driven sommelier, and what's next for that concept?
Well, I mean, the ego-driven chef and ego-driven sommelier hasn't worked out that well recently as a concept, honestly.
No.
I'd say based on the test cases we've seen, that perhaps it's not the best model. And I do think that there's a not being quite as glib, the kind of genius model of chef or sommelier to some degree, which I think for better or worse, the MS program has a little bit of that, has had some of that aura attendant on it. You know, I think it goes against the grain of where, at least in the U.S., where the dining world is headed. There feels like there's a general push towards more community and more, you know, kind of less hierarchical structuring. The truth is, you know, in a kitchen, you can't have I don't know, maybe you can have an entirely flat structure, but it seems that you've got necessarily some hierarchy between, you know, line chef, sous chef, head. But I definitely think that there's a broad movement away from kind of deifying the and genius, and usually white male chef, white male sommelier. There's a lot of questioning of that. It's a really interesting time in that context, because it does feel like a bit of a, within the restaurant world, a bit of a societal shift. Certainly, if you compare it to 20 years ago, to 2000, let's say 2000, massive shift. I mean, that was, you know, that's kind of the height. I feel that the 2000s were the height of the celebrity chef era. I mean, if you go with 20 years before that to 1980, you didn't have TV chefs. You didn't have, you know, that kind of visibility at all. So there's really been, it's been an arc in a strange way, rather than a you know, a kind of flat line that then just exploded. You know, chefs moved into visibility and moved into being stars, and then there was a lot of question about, hey, maybe this isn't the right way to structure this. And I don't know. And I think one thing about COVID that I think, and the pandemic that I think is interesting, is it's accelerated, outside of the pure practical problems and horrible, you know, illness attendant on it. It's accelerated a lot of social things that were already in play. You know, in terms of questions of who gets a voice and who gets power in restaurant and wine world, and in the world in large. And I think that we're going to come out of this in a very interesting situation. And I think that there's a good chance that things will be quite different on the far side of the pandemic, whether that's a giant party, as someone said earlier, you know, which also came out of, you know, not just World War I, but the Spanish influenza epidemic, which killed more people in the US by a factor of 6 than World War I. You know, there was a giant party in the 20s up until the stock market crashed. Maybe we'll see that. I don't know. But I think we're also seeing an acceleration of a lot of social changes at the same time.
And thanks so much, Ray, and Tinashe on this. And we've talked a lot about restaurants. We talked a bit about staff. I'd like to talk about the wine list a bit more, because that's also why we're here, like discuss wine list. James, do you want to shoot the first question?
Sure. Well, I think following up on that one, Ray, do you think that restaurants will be as influential in sort of making fine wine? In other words, you know, to contribute to their reputation as they were previously? I mean, we've talked about ghost kitchens, we've talked about delivery services and all of this. How will restaurants factor into that in terms of making reputations for wines?
You know, I think what's a large kind of, you know, caveat. I don't know if this will happen, but if restaurants come back to being or exceed in popularity where they were before, if people come back in full and are in restaurants and dining and spending money, and certainly at the high end, as I said earlier, people have money to spend. The wealthy have money to spend. You know, I don't see that classic marketing model of placement of wine in high-end restaurants driving retail placement. You know, that I think Mireille Giuliano at Clicquot started eons ago. You know, that's kind of a classic marketing structure for fine wine. I don't necessarily see that disappearing. I think restaurants will retain influence. I think you know, what's happened broadly is there's far outside of restaurants, retail stores, and places to buy, there's just vastly more social media influence and you know, internet knowledge out there than there was before, which dilutes the primacy of any given, you know, venue for creating the image of a wine. You know, if Raj Par on social media, who has a huge following, says, "Oh my God, this Burgundy producer you haven't heard of is extraordinary, that goes a long way to creating that image of a wine. And that's one former sommelier, now winemaker, with, you know, a very large following of very influential people in the business. So there are a lot of avenues that bypass restaurants that weren't there before. But at the same time, the simple structure of going into a restaurant, asking a sommelier what's amazing and what will go with this, and being told this is amazing, you should try this, and trying it and falling in love with it and then going to buy it somewhere is going to come back. I think I feel optimistic about it, at least, put it that way, after having felt pessimistic for about 10 months.
And John, bringing you back with your winemaker or head of a winery maybe hat now, there's been a comment on the chat, like, to accommodate a new world of fine dining at home, or, you know, still offer fine wines with the whole experience. Would producers of the great classics, with Ornellaia is, of course, be willing to bottle in 250 or 500 ml in order to be able to serve this? And also, on top of all of that, like, when you are Ornellaia or Moscato, when you are in that, you know, when you are all the amazing estates that you represent, and you depend so much to some extent on restaurants, how do you adapt, and how can you accompany? You were talking about working together. What's the role of wineries in all that?
I think in terms of alternative formats, I think it's been really interesting to see the acceptance, both trade and consumer, of small format virtual tastings. I mean, they've become such an essential part of all of our lives, and the technology that's springing up around the preparation of those small samples. I think it'll be really interesting to see to what extent that continues, you know, once we're all allowed out of lockdown. I think one of the big shifts that we'll see is almost there's going to be a big change in the footprint of restaurants. And when I say that, what I mean is the big financial centres, I think, will become less and less important. And if I use London as an example, the City of London, Canary Wharf, even Mayfair, there's such centres of fine dining at the moment, and all of those big financial organisations are relocating their staff to virtual working. And what that means we're going to see is a huge uptick in high quality dining in more suburban areas, and I think a real democratisation of fine wine on trade, because that money that was being spent in those city centres is going to shift out. I think from a winery perspective, that's actually really exciting, because I think if you combine that shifting geographic profile with the increasing acceptance of digital and online tastings, it means you can do some really interesting things. So when I was in my previous role, we found it was incredibly powerful to take winemakers to smaller restaurants outside of the cities. I remember we did a Spanish outreach program, you know, looking at sort of indigenous Spanish varieties, you know, Mazuelo, Albio, even stuff like Bobal. And we took those wines and we took them to out into the restaurants and connected the winemakers directly with the sommeliers. And you can do that digitally. And I think with that shift in profile from the big city centres out to smaller towns and smaller suburbs, as a winery, it means that we can then use the digital channel to communicate directly through to sommeliers on a much broader geographical footprint. And if we can connect directly with sommeliers and inspire that passion in the wines, and that can be translated across to consumers, I think that's actually, you know, a really interesting opportunity for us to build deeper relationships through sommeliers to consumers. So actually, you know, I think it's this level of change that we're going to see in consumer behavior, and therefore in the on-trade, I think is a really exciting opportunity for people to change their model in terms of how they communicate through.
And you're talking about, you know, big European and I suppose American cities as well. But Tinashe, that's something that you've noted through your app, and you touch people that are not in the city centre anymore, and your profile has changed a bit. Like the consumer that you touch through the app are not the same that you had at the test kitchen, for example.
Yeah, definitely. We're seeing people getting on the app, mainly on the outskirts, not even the local ones as well, which was quite an a good revelation to us. So I think, you know, it's just a change in uptake of the wines. And those who never had the confidence to go to the restaurant, but they had the money to spend, are all of a sudden feeling empowered.
Yeah, and so enlarging also people, as you were saying, John, bringing more people to the fine wine experience and enjoying fine wine.
I think you can do comparative tastings in that way. I think that brings you back to the smaller formats. You know, when you look at, you know, within Acheval Frey, you've got 3 single Finca wines that are quite different in profile. You know, you can start providing tasting packs through to consumers in those smaller formats. I think that becomes really interesting.
And that's also a way we always talk about accessibility and exclusivity in fine wine, and how to balance that. How can you make a super expensive wine, well, to a normal people, accessible to the bigger number? But I guess smaller format is such an interesting thing to open the door to your expensive wine or to your premium range. And to touch on what you've said also, John, in making those connections, we had an interesting conversation with one of the master sommeliers who's actually in the audience today, yesterday, prepping that, when I asked him, well, in your restaurant, you know, do you give feedback to the winemakers about, you know, what the consumer thought about your wine? And he said, well, no, because actually I don't really thought, you know, winemakers were interested in getting feedback from the consumers. I know they're interested in getting feedback from me as a sommelier, or from the trade, or from critics, but I didn't actually realize that they would be interested in getting feedback from the consumers. And then on the other hand, we've got a big marketing agency that works with fine wine wineries and says, well, winemakers do really want to know, but they don't know they're allowed to ask the sommelier for feedback. So we are like seating that big misunderstanding where, you know, everyone talks about data, and then I wonder if we could just talk to each other at one point. You know, sommelier wanted to share the feedback, winemakers wanted to hear about the feedback of the consumers. There's certainly something that can be done here. I know we had loads of questions that I'd like to take, you know, the next 10 minutes to address about, you know, fine wine list and their evolution. James, you had a questions for Ray about what the fine wine list of tomorrow is going to look like.
I did. Well, I find it interesting, John's comment about the move of workers to suburban areas as you know, remote workers, and then the use of restaurants and the restaurants in the suburban areas, because I find this an interesting phenomenon in that one of the threats to restaurants and wine lists pre-COVID was the rising rents in city centers. And so I wonder how this becomes an opportunity now for people who were already facing difficulties in city centers to start moving out to suburban areas. And in those terms, both for Ray, Tinashe, John, any of you who would like to answer this, but specifically probably for Ray in the US, how does that change styles? Are there any regions, styles, price points that you think are likely to do better in coming months, possibly post-COVID, hopefully? So any comments or insights on those?
Yeah, I think, I mean, whether the move out of city centers, which I think you're right, is, you know, it was happening before COVID hit, certainly with New York, where rents are just out of control. Whether that plays into the change in what's considered fine wine on a restaurant list, I don't know. I do think that there's been a broadening of what is allowed to be fine wine. Let's say, you know, it's, and that's been ongoing well before COVID. It once was, you know, classified Growth Bordeaux, Grand Cru Burgundy, and not even Napa Cap, and now it's, you know, it extends. Over time, it's been just an ongoing extension of what that realm can be. You know, there are properties in the Languedoc-Roussillon which qualify as fine wine, I suppose, without question. Certainly by price, they do. The same thing, you know, there are Greek, you know, wineries that would qualify to me as fine wine at this point, and it partly is dependent on your definition of fine wine. And I know there's a white paper that I haven't read yet, you know, and whether it's driven by price point or reputation or some combination of the two. But I think certainly with wine lists in the US, there's a broadening of what's available even at top restaurants in terms of the realms of regions that are available, the kinds of wines that are available. The latest thing that's happened to me in that context has been called the cultification or the rarityfication of some of the natural wines. Natural wines started as a kind of oppositional movement, and most of the wines were quite affordable. And now you see some natural wines that are in the $200, $220, $250 retail price zone, which seems oddly at odds with the natural wine ethos, but they've become, status cult items and for a small subset. And that to me is, whether that qualifies as fine wine, I don't know, but it definitely is qualifying as something that ends up on high-end restaurant lists. You wouldn't necessarily be surprised to find, Magma from Cornelissen on the Le Bernardin list or something. Aldo may shoot me for saying that. I don't know, but it's an interesting, democratization of the question of what is fine wine, and I think restaurant lists are where that happens most rapidly, to my mind. And it's fascinating to watch. It's really great.
Yeah, and sorry, I was just going to say, in judging the World's Best Wine List Awards, one of the countries that has a hard time finding wines from around the world because of import restrictions and things is South Africa. And I was just curious, Tinashe, what your thoughts are in terms of the evolution of wine lists in South Africa, because it's a very different viewpoint, I think, than perhaps the US or the UK.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think that the caliber of fine wines in the UK or New York, it's pretty much different from what we have here. The fine wines we get, they're already in minute. Most of them never end up on the restaurant list anyway, private clients and private buyers. But like I agree as well. I think the definition is just keep on evolving. In South Africa, we're coming up with our own terms of fine wines, which are difficult to source and the quality which is high. So you tend to find those on generally South African top list, but in terms of global fine wine, a little bit so this side.
Got it. Thank you.
And on the other side, maybe John, are you going to target particular markets or particular kind of restaurants for your wines? If we can take the other angle of the question.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Ray's comment about sort of the democratization of fine wine. Everything that we've seen suggests that the classic regions have got less and less of a hold. And I think as you have there's a new generation of consumer coming up, and as they get older, obviously they've got more and more disposable income to spend on wine. And they're the consumers who grew up with the sort of the explosion of the new world, and they're used to seeing a much broader selection of wine styles on lists. And naturally, as their wallets evolve, they expect to see super premium wines from those sorts of regions on their wine lists. So for us, thinking with a non-French hat on, obviously, not just Europe, but the US and all the markets you would expect in Asia are all sort of huge growth opportunities. But what I think is exciting, with my sort of Argentine hat on, is the concept of fine Argentine wines sitting on a breadth of restaurant wine lists alongside class growth Bordeaux and top end Burgundy. It is much more acceptable these days, and something that you're much more likely to see. So, but I think it also opens up a less formal style of restaurant where the list tends to be less traditional in its construction, but you can still justify putting some really high-end wines on there from non-French origin. So I think the breadth is what's interesting as much as anything else.
Antoine, you are based in Lebanon, but you work with chefs from all around the world, and often in not as big wine market as the UK. I know you've worked with chefs through South America, in the East, of course. Are there any trends that you've seen discussing with those chefs that might not be in London or New York or Paris that you think are going to impact restaurants globally?
I'm going to give the example of Lebanon because it's a bit of an extreme example, actually. Not only we were hit by COVID, but before that, we had a huge economic and financial crisis that has impacted every single person. Capital control, people don't have access to their money in the bank, devaluation of the currency, things are costing 6, 7, 8 times more than before. Importing is getting very complicated, and we used to depend a lot of imports, especially in the restaurant business. So by necessity, what people are doing here is they are starting to produce things locally. And they are, first of all, they start to realize that they need to have something that is sustainable, and that quality is very important. And that short circuit between the producer and the table is becoming very important. I was talking to a chef from a 5-star hotel, and he was telling me luxury will not be bringing produce from all over the world, you know, high-end stuff. It's going to be to have locally grown, in-season produce and rediscovering our culinary heritage. It's trying to strengthen that part very strongly, because we do have a very rich culinary culture beyond the things that everybody knows internationally, like the hummus and the tabbouleh and all these kind of things. But there's a lot of dishes that people are not really aware, which are the base of the Lebanese cuisine, which is also regional, even in a small country like ours. So there's that realization, first of all, that we need to survive. Basically, we need to depend on that, on the locally produced. And that would redefine whatever excellence or luxury, if you want to call that way. That's on the food side. On the wine side, Lebanon has been a wine growing country for a very long time, and by necessity as well, they need to look at foreign markets more and more. So for them, the way to position themselves is to find the right story. It's to find a way of linking to the heritage that they have and trying to sell that as well. So I think there's a narrative in terms of the positioning of the products and produce that you have in the country, the way you want to showcase them outside if you need them, if you depend on the export. And I think people are getting more and more sensitive about that, because there's so many products out there. There's so many so many wines out there. How are you different? There's a lot of good quality wines. So I think that they really have realized that the way you position, the way you tell your story, that you engage with them, and that people can see that not only they will support, they will have a great wine, let's say, but they will also support a local economy that is in a bad shape. And I think that this is something that could, probably in other countries which are going through hard time, not probably as much as we have. The amount of people that were unemployed in the hospitality business is staggering. We have 250,000 people that are involved in the hospitality business, 200,000 directly, 350 indirectly, and there's no furlough. There's nothing. The government doesn't do anything. So since we stopped about a year ago, plus the explosion of the Beirut port, there's no money. There's nothing. So people had to rely one way or the other on what they can do locally. Yes.
Well, no, sorry. I was just wondering about Laurent and the situation of France, not to come back, because I think the French government has been more helpful than maybe the Lebanese government on that side, helping the restaurant industry. But Laurent, in a country like France, John has touched about it, Ray as well, and Antoine just did, that notion of local and being more local in what you cook and what you drink. But it's always kind of been the case for wine lists in France. They've always been kind of local. We don't really allow foreigners on our wine list so far. How do you see that notion of local evolved, and how do you see the wine list evolved in a French context?
Well, first, I think I don't drink the same wine as my father, and my daughter doesn't drink the same one as mine. Doesn't mean that what was drinking my father was bad, or what I'm drinking is better than what my daughter is drinking. Just that habits change and the consumer is evolving. And like you said today, more and more consumer and the young generation and the more conscious consumer is looking much more for farm-to-table food, local food in restaurants. Yes, we have more and more restaurants, whether it is high-end three-star restaurant or more local restaurants that are using local product and are featuring that they are using local product or direct to producer product that may come from far away, because what does it mean a local product when you live in Paris? But this trend for sure will, in my mind, will have an impact on the type of wine you are drinking. Because if you eat farm-to-table food, you may drink more organic or natural wine than in a more classic traditional restaurant. And for me, it's a trend today that this new generation, more radical, that are very worried about the planet, will drink sometimes only organic or natural wine, because we all know that you can find the best wine, whether it's organic or not organic. So it doesn't change the quality of the wine, of the amount you want to spend on the wine. And I hope I did answer your question.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I had a big question for all of you, but it's a hard question to translate, because it's, is that focus on local wines on the wine list, is it a hindrance or help in, for the future, for the short and long run? But that's a big question, and of course it won't resonate the same in markets like the UK, like France, or even South Africa and the US, and even more Lebanon. So I'm going to keep that question for, I'll do an entire webinar on that. But I think it's interesting what you said, Laurent, about sustainability. And again, we had that conversation a lot. Do fine wine consumers really care about sustainability? What you said to me, Laurent, when we were prepping this, is that there's going to be a shift, like a massive one, and we have to be ready. We can't just continue as it is, just because fine wine consumers might not care enough now, or enough. But that's coming. And if you want to put in the chat, Laurent, I know that you're working on a very interesting, like you've backed up a project which is called Terroir d'Avenir. So I don't really know how to translate that in English, but terroir that will be important in the future and for our future. That's an interesting concept if people want to go and see how that. Maybe my last question for you, James, my co-moderator, as a judge for the World of Fine Wine Best List Awards. Do you see the way you are going to judge wine list and what makes a good wine list differently in the future than how you judge them before?
Mute in all the places I need to be. I think that we've already seen that to some extent. I have not judged previously with World's Best Wine List until this year. And even then there was discussion about what constitutes a great wine list. And of course, that depends upon what kind of wine list we're discussing. There are those lists that are exhaustive references of wine. Those probably will not change, as Ray and I think a couple of other people pointed out. Those who started with wealthy in the pandemic are even wealthier now. And so those wine lists may not change. Where you start to see some interesting shifts, I think, is smaller and medium-sized wine lists where personality becomes more reflected. And I think Ray touched on this a little bit about the natural wines coming onto those types of wine lists, and more emphasis on social responsibility, social justice, equity. And so I think as we see these new emphasis in terms of generational shifts and social responsibility shifts, we will see a shift in how wine lists get looked at. How that's going to play out, I'm not exactly sure. But the other part of that is with the pandemic, as we've all talked about, while people are emphasizing being at home with each other, and we've all found, I think, to some extent, a new appreciation, though some may not, of being at your home and being with your loved ones. We all want to be out and celebrating with our friends as well. So I think there's this balance between the type of wine list that is enticing for its familiarity and its comfort, and a wine list that is a more challenging wine list. So I think we'll see some balance of those. more so in the future as well, in terms of what's emphasized for great wine lists. And I can't speak directly to World's Best Wine List Awards for World of Fine Wine. I'm only one judge. But I think in general, in evaluating wine lists, those criteria will be more important in the future.
So maybe less your origin, but how you've made the wine is going to be more and more important, I guess. Thank you, everyone. I'd like at that point to call my chair, to call ARENI's chair, Nicole Rollet, who is also the head of Chêne Bleu Wines in France. Hi, Nicole. And Nicole has the amazingly difficult task to sum up an hour and a half discussions where we've touched on so many things in 2 minutes. So we can all, go home and have a glass of wine and think about all those takeaways. As Nicole is doing this, I'm just going to share the results of the poll that we had at the beginning, so you can have a look. You can have one eye on Nicole and one eye on the poll results, so you can see what people think is going to be impacting the reopening the most. Nicole, over to you.
Lovely to listen in on all this, and I think we were all a bit taken aback at the beginning between some of these contradictions that came out right away, between expecting people to be concerned about health and safety and penny pinching, and then on the other hand, rushing out into the streets and opening every expensive bottle and celebrating with as many people as possible, and going back to the city centers. And so it's quite interesting that we've had a difference between the poll results, which suggests that people will remain very cautious and uncomfortable in those spaces, and then the opinion of our experts here that there will be a big rush to enjoy life and celebrate in style. So I certainly hope the former, the latter will win. But we also saw that we need our sommeliers to help us sell those big ticket bottles. And as we look at the changing roles of the sommeliers, if the restaurants can't afford to have them back, they will have to find some way through consultancy, at least in the early days till cash flows get better, to bring the sommelier back to help them with the heavy lifting on some of the more profitable aspects of their business, since they'll be hurting initially at least. And come to the exciting ideas for sommeliers in a minute. There's also going to be a huge lack of staff in restaurants, and especially initially where there's a rush of people and the staff has been scattered all over the place and is uncertain about how long the reopenings will last, etc. There could be a lot of competition for staff, and the staff that is employed, I assume, would then have difficult conditions, difficult hours, etc. Which leads us a bit to the question of the social inequities that have exacerbated over this crisis, and a lot of the social justice issues that we've addressed with some of the people in ghost kitchens or dark kitchens, possibly working in conditions that are not optimal and prepared to take jobs that they wouldn't have because they're in such difficult straits. So the behind the scenes, there's a bit of a challenge there, and we have to keep a watchful eye and work together to make sure that there isn't a big problem that looms. There will also be a split between restaurants of convenience and restaurants that are offering experience, and that to be stuck in the middle will be very difficult, and people will have to choose which side of the equation they want to be on, or at least open up many channels and be very flexible and agile while things settle down and may never go back to how they were before. But this, of course, opens up a risk that we may not be good at everything at once, and we will be trying to resolve the tension between being everything to everybody and being known for our expertise in certain areas. Lastly, on restaurants, we will see that they will have so many challenges around their wine lists. We'll have restaurants with much bigger cash flow problems, so they'll have shorter lists and they'll have shorter menus, at least until they can build up their inventories. And at that point, it's not sure what formats will be most desirable. There will be a demand for smaller formats, but we're not sure that there will be a real, that's a solution, both from winemakers' point of view and from consumers' point of view, if they're really interested in fine wine. There's also a broadening of what is called fine wine and what is allowed to be considered that. So that trend that already started is likely to continue with new regions, more producers. We talked about the cultification of certain natural wines now and their appearance on some of these traditional lists, and that's likely to continue. And younger consumers who are already accustomed to seeing broad definition of fine wine are probably not going to turn the clock back on those things. And finally, the big trends to local products are also spilling over to the desire to drink local wines, but it's not clear yet whether if you are motivated to do the right thing and if it's important for you to do the right thing when you buy a bottle of wine, supporting a local producer or supporting a producer in Lebanon or South Africa, if you're not based there, you know, what is the right moral choice to make as a conscious consumer? There will be some more debate around that. The biggest changes that will take place in restaurant lists are likely to be in smaller and medium-sized restaurants rather than the ones that cater to wealthy people, where there will be a tendency to resort to more traditional comfort wines. And the appearance of social justice as one of the criteria for these smaller and medium-sized restaurants is going to be quite interesting and probably a trend that will continue to grow. The tension between wine lists that are comforting for their familiarity and ones that are experimental and innovative and challenging, I think is something that also I would want to know more about and keep my eye on. And finally, bringing it to sommeliers specifically, we have this situation where there's so many new ways of sommeliers to interact using tech on phones, create new digital forms of interaction. In the chat also talking about maybe like in professors at universities that have become superstars now having a bigger platform. So if you are established in your field, you might just be catapulted to levels of influencer status like you haven't been seen before. But at the same time, the big egos that we saw a few years ago are going to be very out of fashion for the foreseeable future. And the influencers that can emerge from that scene can bypass a lot of the sommeliers on the floor more easily than ever before and make reputations for wineries or break them in ways that weren't imaginable a few years ago. Please let me know if I've forgotten any important points. You're on mute, Pauline.
Sorry. Thanks, Nicole. That was a dense wrap up, but again, it was a dense session. So just to follow up, we had loads of questions on skills and the future of sommeliers, like what type of skills they need to develop, how can they bring value to the restaurants. That's a topic that we are going to follow up with James because we know it's a key one. So we will give you the date to the follow-up webinar, and of course, please join us to explore that. Our next session in April, we are going to launch our big annual study on the fine wine consumer, where we'll be, talking about normal fine wine and the highest of the highest price fine wine, and we will try to compare if they do have the same consumers and how they are likely to evolve. So that would be on the 27th of April. And thank you so much. That was such an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, John, Ray, Antoine, James, Nicole, Tinashe, Laurent, Stéphane, and all of you in the audience that helped me prepare that session, because there were so many of you that reached out and gave me content and ideas for being here. Have a lovely evening, day, morning, and we will see you on the 27th of April for the session on the fine wine consumer, if not before. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.